Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Why does the divine masculine often change after true intimacy? Why does one real connection affect him more than years of ordinary love ever could? Sometimes it is not the relationship itself that changes him. It is what the intimacy reveals inside him. The parts he hid, the wounds he buried, the tenderness he never knew how to protect without shutting down. Because true intimacy does not simply make a man feel closer. It makes him see himself. And once a man has truly seen himself through the mirror of deep connection, he can never return to the same inner life again. So why does he become quieter, more distant, more reflective, or sometimes more devoted after real intimacy? Why does he seem transformed, conflicted, or emotionally undone by a bond he cannot explain? In this video, we'll explore the hidden reason the divine masculine changes after true intimacy, and why that change is often messy before it becomes meaningful. Chapter 1. The change no one understands. There is a kind of change that happens in the divine masculine after true intimacy. And from the outside, it rarely makes immediate sense. He may become quieter, more distant, more reflective, more emotionally conflicted. Sometimes he seems softer but harder to reach at the same time. Sometimes he appears more present inwardly, yet less expressive outwardly. Sometimes he pulls back right after the moment that should have brought him closer. Sometimes the very connection that seemed to open his heart is the one that leaves him looking the most uncertain, the most overwhelmed, the most unlike himself. And this is where so many people become confused, because they expect deep intimacy to create clarity right away. They expect that if a man has truly felt something sacred, something real, something soul deep, then his behavior should immediately become simple, more obvious, more direct, more stable. They assume that true connection should make him easier to understand. But often, the first thing true intimacy does is the opposite. It makes him harder to read. Not because he feels less, but because he feels more than he knows how to hold. This is the change no one understands. People see the aftermath of soul-level intimacy and think, what happened to him? Why is he different now? Why does he seem affected, but not fully available? Why does he seem altered, but not yet clear? Why does he feel so close one moment and so far the next? Why does one real connection seem to change him more than years of ordinary love ever could? These are the kinds of questions that sit at the heart of the divine masculine journey. And to answer them, we have to begin with one powerful truth. True intimacy does not simply create connection. It creates revelation. It reveals the man to himself. And once that revelation begins, he cannot return to the exact same inner life he had before. That is why the change can be so unsettling. Before true intimacy, a man may move through life in ways that feel organized, functional, and emotionally manageable. He knows who he is in the roles he has learned to play. He knows how to be composed. He knows how to be strong, productive, useful, focused, reliable, admired, desired, respected, or distant when necessary. He may know how to create attraction. He may know how to maintain control. He may know how to keep his emotional world compartmentalized enough to survive without being fully consumed by it. From the outside, this can look like stability. But stability and self-knowing are not always the same thing. A man can appear steady while remaining deeply separated from parts of himself. He can appear successful while still feeling emotionally unvisited inside. He can appear calm while privately carrying tenderness, loneliness, fear, and longing he has never fully named. And then true intimacy enters. Not superficial attraction. Not just physical closeness. Not romantic excitement alone. But true intimacy. The kind that reaches beyond chemistry and touches the hidden interior. The kind that makes performance feel thin. The kind that quietly says, I can feel there is more of you here than what you usually show. The kind that reaches the soul before the mind has a chance to organize what is happening. And that is when the change begins. Not because someone is trying to change him. Not because love magically fixes him. Not because the connection forces growth in some theatrical, instant way. But because something in him has now been touched that he can no longer completely ignore. That is what people often miss. The divine masculine does not always change after true intimacy because the relationship itself becomes dramatic or complicated. He changes because intimacy reveals an inner reality that was already there but hidden. The experience does not create his depth. It exposes it. It does not invent his wounds. It activates them. It does not place a soul inside him. It awakens the one that has been waiting underneath his defenses all along. And once a man encounters himself at that level, even briefly, he is no longer dealing only with another person. He is dealing with his own interior truth. That is why the change can look so strange. From the outside, it may appear that nothing concrete has happened. Maybe there was a conversation, a moment of closeness, a stretch of emotional honesty, a tenderness he did not expect, a sense of being seen that went deeper than usual. Maybe the intimacy was quiet, not dramatic at all. Maybe there was no grand declaration, no huge event, no obvious turning point anyone else would understand. And yet something inside him shifted. Because soul-level shifts do not always need outer spectacle. Sometimes they happen in a glance, in a silence that feels too full, in the experience of being understood without having to explain everything, in the ache of realizing someone has touched a place in him he has spent years protecting, in the simple but terrifying awareness that this connection feels different. And when it feels different, he becomes different. Not necessarily outwardly at first, but inwardly, yes. He begins to think differently, feel differently, remember differently, question differently. He may not be able to explain it yet, but some old normal no longer feels fully normal. Some old way of relating no longer fits as smoothly. Some old version of himself no longer feels complete enough to live inside without discomfort. That is the beginning of change. And this is why true intimacy can alter the divine masculine in ways that neither he nor others immediately understand. Because the change is not always linear. It does not follow a clean emotional script. It does not always move from closeness to certainty to devotion in a straight line. Sometimes it moves from closeness to disruption, from recognition to fear, from tenderness to confusion, from emotional opening to inner conflict. That does not mean the intimacy was false. Sometimes it means it was real enough to matter. This is one of the hardest truths for many people to hold. We often imagine that if something is real, it should make us clear right away. But real intimacy does not only bring warmth, it also brings exposure. And exposure is difficult for a man whose identity may have been built around emotional control. To be seen deeply is not only comforting, it is disarming. To feel something undeniable is not only beautiful, it is destabilizing. To encounter a love or connection that reaches beneath the surface is not only healing. It can also confront him with everything in himself that is not yet ready to live in that openness consistently. So yes, he changes. But that change may first look like withdrawal instead of expression, silence instead of clarity, tension instead of ease, restlessness instead of resolution. Why? Because the old self and the awakened self are now standing in the same room. The old self says, stay in control. The awakened self says, something real has happened here. The old self says, do not get too exposed. The awakened self says, you cannot pretend you felt nothing. The old self says, return to what is familiar. The awakened self says, what is familiar no longer feels enough. This is the internal split that true intimacy can create in the early stages of change. And when a man lives inside that split, his outer behavior may look contradictory. He may feel deeply and say little. He may care intensely and still pull back. He may be transformed inwardly before he knows how to live that transformation outwardly. He may seem less certain not because the connection means less, but because it means more than his current emotional structure knows how to carry. That distinction is essential, because without it, people misread the divine masculine all the time. They see the retreat and assume there was no depth. They see the silence and assume there was no love. They see the inconsistency and assume there was no truth. But often, something much more complex is happening. He is changing in places that are not yet visible. He is confronting things he has not had to confront before. He is beginning to see that the parts of him he thought were strength may also be forms of protection. He is beginning to realize that emotional distance is not the same as peace. He is beginning to feel that the old ways of staying safe may now be the same ways he stays disconnected. He is beginning to suspect that what touched him through true intimacy is not just another feeling to manage. It is a call into a deeper masculinity, a deeper honesty, a deeper confrontation with the soul. And that is why this chapter matters. Because if we do not understand this first layer, we will misunderstand everything that comes after it. We will think the change is random. We will think the confusion means the connection was not real. We will think the struggle means the soul was not moved. But the truth is often the opposite. The more real the intimacy, the more impossible it becomes for the divine masculine to remain exactly as he was. This does not mean he instantly becomes healed. It does not mean he immediately becomes emotionally available. It does not mean he magically knows what to do. What it means is that the old identity has been interrupted. And interrupted identities do not always behave gracefully. Sometimes they become quiet. Sometimes reactive. Sometimes reflective. Sometimes conflicted. Sometimes deeply inward. But beneath all of that, a deeper process is beginning. A man who has experienced true intimacy may suddenly find that ordinary life does not land the same way. Surface-level interactions may feel emptier. Old distractions may work less effectively. The life he built to stay emotionally protected may start to feel too small for what his heart now knows. He may not say this aloud. He may not even consciously understand it yet. But somewhere inside, he has crossed a threshold. And thresholds change people, even before they know how to explain the crossing. That is why the divine masculine may seem like a mystery after true intimacy. He is not only responding to another person. He is responding to the fact that something inside him has now awakened enough to challenge his previous way of being. He is no longer living only from habit. He is starting to live in the aftermath of recognition. Recognition of what? Recognition that he has deeper needs than he admitted. Recognition that he is more emotionally affected than he allowed himself to believe. Recognition that love, when it is real, does not just make him feel wanted. It makes him feel revealed. And being revealed changes a man. It changes the questions he asks. It changes the kinds of connections he can tolerate. It changes how satisfying old patterns feel. It changes how much inner dishonesty he can live with before he feels the cost of it. It changes the relationship he has with his own soul. That is why the change no one understands is not really about the outer behavior first. It is about the inner awakening that outer behavior struggles to keep up with. It is about a man discovering that true intimacy did not simply give him a beautiful moment. It gave him a mirror. And once he has seen himself in that mirror, he cannot fully go back to being the man he was before. He may try. He may resist. He may delay. He may turn quiet, distant, or uncertain. But something in him already knows. This touched me. This changed me. This revealed something I can no longer unknow. And that is where the Real journey begins. Because chapter 1 is not just telling us that the divine masculine changes after true intimacy. It is telling us why that change feels so confusing at first. It feels confusing because real intimacy does not merely bring him closer to another person. It brings him closer to himself. And for a man who has spent years living behind roles, armor, control, and carefully managed emotional distance, that may be the most disruptive transformation of all. Not because it breaks him, but because it begins breaking open the parts of him that were never meant to stay hidden forever. Chapter 2. True intimacy does more than create closeness. Most people think intimacy simply makes two people feel closer. They imagine it as emotional warmth, physical vulnerability, romantic openness, affectionate words, shared silence, or the feeling of being connected in a way that is deeper than ordinary attraction. And while all of those things can be part of intimacy, true intimacy goes much further than that. It does not merely create closeness between two people. It creates contact with the self. That is why it affects the divine masculine so profoundly. Because for many men, closeness is not the hardest thing. The hardest thing is what closeness reveals. A man can enjoy connection. He can enjoy affection. He can enjoy desire, companionship, attraction, emotional support, and even tenderness without being fully transformed by any of it. He can move through relationships, feel love in the way he currently understands it, and still remain partly hidden inside himself. He can let someone near his life without letting them near the deepest chambers of his soul. And often, he does not even realize he is doing this. That is what makes true intimacy so different. True intimacy does not simply bring another person closer to him. It brings him closer to what he has been avoiding within himself. It does not stop at the level of romance. It does not stop at the level of emotional comfort. It does not stop at the level of physical or even spiritual attraction. It goes further inward. It touches the places where identity, fear, longing, memory, tenderness, and self-protection all live together. That is why true intimacy can feel so beautiful and so disruptive at the same time. Because the moment it becomes real, it is no longer only about the other person. It becomes about what awakens inside him in response to being met so deeply. And that is a very different kind of experience. Many people are familiar with attraction. Many people are familiar with chemistry. Many people are familiar with emotional intensity. But emotional intensity is not always intimacy. Chemistry can excite the nervous system. Desire can activate longing. Attention can create attachment. But true intimacy does something more sacred and more difficult. It dissolves the distance between the man and his own hidden truth. That is why it changes him. Not because intimacy is automatically magical. Not because every meaningful relationship becomes transformational. But because when intimacy is real, it reaches the part of him that no surface connection ever quite touches. A man may be desired many times in his life. He may be admired. He may be wanted. He may be pursued. He may be loved in ways that are sincere, but still remain mostly on the surface of who he is. But it is rare for him to feel deeply seen. And that is where true intimacy begins to move beyond closeness. To feel close to someone is one thing. To feel seen by someone is another. To feel seen in a way that reaches past the role, the image, the performance, the masculine composure, the emotional management, and the carefully controlled identity he presents to the world. That is where something deeper begins. Because now intimacy is no longer just giving him comfort. It is giving him revelation. He begins to realize that he is not only being loved for how he appears. He is being felt for what he carries. And that can be almost unbearable at first. Why? Because what he carries is not always simple. He may carry old grief. Old shame, old longing, a deep need to be known, a fear of needing too much, a fear of being fully seen and then left, a fear of emotional dependence, a fear of being softened by love and losing the control he used to survive. So when intimacy remains surface level, he can stay relatively stable. He can enjoy it without having to confront too much. He can participate while still maintaining internal distance. He can give enough to stay connected while keeping the deeper self protected. But true intimacy changes the equation. Because true intimacy is not satisfied with emotional choreography. It is not satisfied with closeness that never becomes truth. It begins to ask more of him, even without speaking. It asks, can you let yourself be felt here? Can you stop managing the impression and allow the reality? Can you stay present when what is being touched is not just desire, but vulnerability? Can you bear the fact that someone now senses the tenderness you have spent years hiding? These are the questions that surface connection never truly asks. And that is why surface connection does not always transform the divine masculine. He can stay intact inside it. But true intimacy interrupts the old intactness. It does not destroy him. It reveals where he was only holding himself together through distance. This is the part many people miss. They imagine intimacy as something sweet, soothing, or reassuring. And yes, it can be all of those things. But sacred intimacy is also exposing. It exposes the gap between who he appears to be and what he feels beneath the appearance. It exposes the gap between how strong he looks and how guarded he has become. It exposes the gap between his capacity to love and his capacity to receive love consciously. And once those gaps are exposed, he starts changing, whether he means to or not. That is why true intimacy does more than create closeness. It creates inner consequence. It stays with him after the moment ends. It echoes in his body, in his thoughts, in his silence, in the way he remembers the connection. It follows him back into ordinary life and makes ordinary life feel less ordinary. Things that once distracted him may no longer work the same way. Interactions that once felt enough may begin to feel thin. Emotional habits that once protected him may begin to feel more like prisons than shelter. And from the outside, this can be difficult to understand. Because all anyone else may see is that something changed after the closeness. Maybe he pulled back. Maybe he became quieter. Maybe he stopped speaking so freely. Maybe he became more reflective. Maybe he became more inconsistent. Maybe he began showing signs of deep inner conflict. And people often assume that intimacy caused confusion because it was not real enough. But many times the opposite is true. It caused confusion because it was real enough to reach a deeper layer than he was ready to navigate easily. This is why the divine masculine can seem altered after true intimacy in ways that do not always look immediately loving from the outside. Because love, when it is deep enough, does not only awaken tenderness, it awakens confrontation. It confronts the parts of him that still live in self-protection. It confronts the emotional structures he built to stay in control. It confronts the way he learned to separate feeling from expression. It confronts the old belief that he can be deeply moved without having to deeply change. True intimacy says otherwise. It says, if you have truly been touched, then something in you must now respond. Not perform. Respond. And there is a difference. Performance is external. Response is internal. Performance manages appearance. Response reorganizes truth. That is why one true intimate connection can affect a man more deeply than years of relationships built on habit, compatibility, or even affection alone. Because the soul does not awaken simply because time passes. It awakens when something reaches it. It awakens when a connection becomes more than emotional interaction and turns into inner recognition. Recognition of what? Recognition that he is more sensitive than he admitted. Recognition that he is more hungry for real love than he realized. Recognition that he has been more lonely inside his control than he allowed himself to see. Recognition that he cannot keep living entirely from the outer self if the inner self has now begun to stir. That is why true intimacy can feel so disproportionate compared to the external event itself. Maybe it was only a few moments. Maybe it was one conversation. Maybe it was one season of real closeness. Maybe it was one experience of being understood without effort. And yet those moments can shake him more than years of ordinary interactions. Why? Because truth is not measured by duration alone. Sometimes one authentic encounter reaches further than years of surface closeness. Sometimes one moment of being seen undoes a lifetime of emotional distance. Sometimes one intimate bond becomes the mirror through which a man realizes how much of himself he has never fully lived. And once that realization begins, the change is unavoidable. Again, not always visible right away. Not always graceful. Not always mature in the beginning. But unavoidable. Because even if he retreats, something inside him now knows more. Even if he goes silent, something inside him is still responding. Even if he tries to go back to normal, normal does not feel the same. That is the power of true intimacy. It leaves an imprint, not only because of the other person, but because of the self it revealed. And perhaps that is the deepest reason true intimacy does more than create closeness. Closeness alone can remain relational. It can exist between two people and stay there. But true intimacy crosses that boundary. It moves from relationship into revelation. It enters the deeper architecture of who he is. It touches the buried self. It makes hidden things visible. It creates an encounter not only with love, but with truth. And truth changes people. It changes what they can ignore. It changes what feels satisfying. It changes what feels empty. It changes the distance they can tolerate between who they are and how they live. For the divine masculine, this means that after true intimacy, he may not yet know what to do, but he can no longer honestly claim that nothing happened. Something happened. Something opened. Something reached him. Something unsettled the old balance. And that is why intimacy is never just about closeness. Closeness can be enjoyed. True intimacy must be reckoned with. Closeness can comfort the heart. True intimacy can awaken the soul. Closeness can stay within the relationship. True intimacy follows him into himself. That is why he changes. Not simply because someone came near, but because someone came near enough to make distance from himself no longer possible in the same way. And once a man begins losing the ability to hide from his own heart, the real transformation has already begun. Chapter 3. He changes because he is no longer able to hide from himself. There is a moment after true intimacy when the divine masculine is no longer only reacting to another person. He is reacting to himself. And that is where the real change begins. Most people think the transformation happens because of what he feels for her. They assume the story is only about love, attachment, longing, attraction, or emotional impact. They focus on the bond between two people and ask, why did this connection affect him so much? Why did he become different afterward? Why did one intimate experience change his energy, his behavior, his inner world? But the deeper answer is this. He changes because true intimacy makes hiding from himself much harder. It is not only that he feels more. It is that he sees more. He sees the parts of himself that old patterns kept covered. He sees the needs he spent years denying. He sees the tenderness he called weakness. He sees the loneliness beneath his control. He sees the fear beneath his distance. He sees the longing beneath his restraint. And once a man begins to see those things clearly, he cannot go back to the same version of unconsciousness. That is why the change can feel so unsettling. before true intimacy, a man may have learned how to live in a state of emotional division without fully noticing it. He may know how to function, achieve, provide, protect, stay composed, and move through life with a kind of practiced masculine steadiness. He may know how to stay desirable, respected, or self-contained. He may know how to keep his emotions organized enough to prevent them from taking over. He may even believe this means he knows himself. But knowing how to manage yourself is not always the same as knowing yourself. That is the hidden fracture. A man can be highly functional and still remain deeply estranged from parts of his soul. He can know how to maintain order while never fully entering his own inner world. He can know how to survive without knowing how to feel safe in truth. And then true intimacy enters. Not casual affection. Not surface-level attraction. Not just emotional warmth or chemistry. But true intimacy. The kind that reaches beneath the practiced self and touches the unguarded one. The kind that does not merely say, "I like you." It says, without words, "I can feel there is more in you than you let the world see." And that is when hiding becomes harder. Because now he is no longer only maintaining an image. Now he is being met beyond the image. And being met beyond the image changes everything. A man can hide from others for a long time. He can hide behind composure, behind capability, behind silence, behind success, behind stoicism, behind charm, behind emotional distance. He can even hide inside relationships by offering enough to stay connected while keeping the deeper self protected. But once intimacy becomes real, the hiding place begins to collapse. Not always dramatically. Sometimes very quietly. Sometimes the collapse begins in a moment of being truly listened to. Sometimes it begins when someone responds to the feeling beneath his words rather than the words themselves. Sometimes it begins when he realizes that in this connection, his usual strategies are no longer enough. He cannot simply impress his way through it. He cannot simply control the tone of it. He cannot simply remain half-known and still feel untouched. Something in him is now being asked to show up more honestly. And that honesty is what begins to transform him. Why? Because hiding is exhausting. Even when a person does not consciously realize they are doing it, hiding takes energy. It takes effort to remain disconnected from one's own depth. It takes effort to hold together an identity built around self-control when the heart is quietly asking for more truth. It takes effort to keep tenderness buried, need denied, longing minimized, and vulnerability translated into silence. Many divine masculine men have spent years becoming fluent in that effort. They may not call it hiding. They may call it maturity, practicality, strength, independence, focus, control. But after true intimacy, something begins to reveal the cost. The cost of always holding back. The cost of always staying internally guarded. The cost of being desired but not known. The cost of functioning well while feeling unseen in the places that matter most. The cost of never fully admitting how deeply he can actually feel. And once he sees the cost, his old normal starts to crack. This is where the inner conflict begins. Part of him wants to go back. Back to order. Back to distance. Back to the familiar identity. Back to the emotional structures that helped him survive. But another part of him now knows too much. He knows what it felt like to be seen. He knows what it felt like to be touched in a deeper place. He knows what it felt like when presence became more powerful than performance. He knows what it felt like when intimacy made him feel not only wanted, but revealed. And that kind of knowing is difficult to erase. This is why the divine masculine often changes in ways that look confusing from the outside. Because the battle is no longer only between him and the relationship. It is now between him and his own self-concept. Between the man he has learned to be and the man something deeper is asking him to become. That gap can feel enormous. Because self-concept is rarely just a set of beliefs. It is often a structure of protection. A man may not simply believe he needs to stay composed. He may survive through composure. He may not simply prefer emotional control. He may experience it as the condition that keeps him from feeling overwhelmed, dependent, exposed, or unsafe. So when intimacy begins asking more truth from him, it can feel like a threat to the very structure that once kept him together. That is why he may become quieter, more inward, more hesitant, more conflicted. Not because the intimacy meant little, but because it reached a place he can no longer manage as easily as before. He begins noticing things he did not notice before. He notices how quickly he deflects when something feels too real. He notices how much effort it takes to appear unaffected. He notices how often silence has been a shield rather than peace. He notices that what he once called being fine may actually have been emotional numbness. He notices the strange emptiness of old patterns. He notices that the kind of connection he has now tasted makes surface-level relating feel thinner than it used to. These realizations may not come all at once. Often they arrive in fragments. A quiet ache here, a moment of reflection there, a growing discomfort with the old self, a strange inability to return fully to what once distracted him, a repeated memory of a conversation, a look, a feeling, a silence that somehow changed him more than it should have. This is how hiding starts to fail. Not because someone is forcing him to confess, but because his own interior is becoming louder. And when the interior becomes louder, the mask becomes heavier. This is a crucial moment in the divine masculine journey. Because for perhaps the first time, he begins to realize that what he thought was strength may also be limitation. What he thought was emotional discipline may also be emotional suppression. What he thought was self-protection may also be self-abandonment. What he thought was independence may also be loneliness in a more socially acceptable form. And that realization is painful. Not because he is weak, but because awareness hurts when it arrives after years of unconscious adaptation. It hurts to see how much of yourself you have hidden from yourself. It hurts to realize that some of the things you relied on most are now the very things keeping you separate from love. It hurts to feel that the life you built to stay safe may no longer be enough to make you feel alive. That is why true intimacy can create such a deep internal reorganization. It does not simply awaken desire. It awakens self-recognition. And self-recognition is rarely comfortable at first. Because once he sees himself more clearly, he also sees the contradiction. He sees how deeply he longs and how quickly he retreats. He sees how much he wants truth and how often he still chooses protection. He sees how much he values real connection and how poorly his old identity knows how to sustain it. He sees how deeply he can feel and how little language he may have for those feelings. He sees that there is a difference between being emotionally controlled and being emotionally integrated. And once that distinction is felt, something begins to change at the foundation. He may still resist. He may still struggle. He may still move in inconsistent ways. But he is no longer fully asleep to himself. That is the key. True intimacy has interrupted the sleep. It has interrupted the assumption that he can live indefinitely from only the outer layers of self. It has interrupted the illusion that emotional distance has no cost. It has interrupted the story that he is untouched by things that in truth affect him profoundly. It has interrupted the quiet bargain he made long ago. I will stay in control, and in return I will not have to feel too much. Now he does feel too much. Or at least more than he can dismiss. And because of that, he begins changing not only in relation to the connection, but in relation to himself. He may ask deeper questions. Why did this affect me so strongly? Why do I feel exposed by something so gentle? Why can I not simply move on the way I used to? Why does ordinary life feel different after being seen like that? Why do I feel both drawn toward truth and terrified of it? These are not small questions. These are awakening questions. Because awakening begins the moment a man can no longer fully lie to himself about what he feels, what he fears, what he longs for, and what his old identity is costing him. This does not mean he becomes instantly healed. It does not mean he immediately knows how to love well. It does not mean he suddenly becomes expressive, available, and clear in every way. But it does mean that the interior division has become visible. And once inner division becomes visible, transformation becomes possible. That is the sacred tension of Chapter 3. The divine masculine changes because true intimacy removes some of his ability to remain hidden from himself. It becomes harder to dismiss his own heart, harder to minimize his own need, harder to pretend his old forms of control are enough, harder to remain loyal to a version of masculinity built entirely around restraint, distance, and emotional concealment. He begins to feel the difference between being guarded and being whole. And that difference changes a man, because wholeness asks more of him than guardedness ever did. Guardedness only asks him to survive. Wholeness asks him to tell the truth. Guardedness asks him to stay safe. Wholeness asks him to become real. Guardedness asks him to maintain identity. Wholeness asks him to let false identity begin to fall. That is why the process can look messy. Because the old self does not disappear gracefully. It resists. It retreats. It negotiates. It delays. It hides again. But every time it hides, it now hides under the light of recognition. And that light matters. Because once a man has seen himself even once through the doorway of true intimacy, he may wander, delay, or resist, but he cannot fully return to the same kind of blindness. Something in him has been named without words. Something in him has been touched beyond image. Something in him has been called forward. And whether he answers quickly or slowly, clearly or painfully, the call remains. That is why he changes. Not only because someone loved him, but because through true intimacy, he encountered the parts of himself he could no longer honestly abandon. And when a man reaches that threshold, his life is no longer only about managing emotion. It becomes about whether he is willing to meet his own soul. Chapter 4. True intimacy activates both love and wounds. One of the deepest reasons the divine masculine changes after true intimacy is that true intimacy does not awaken only love. It awakens wounds too. And until this is understood, so much of his behavior will remain misread. People often imagine that when a man feels something real, something sacred, something soul deep, that feeling should naturally make him warmer, clearer, more expressive, more steady. They assume love should simplify him. They assume that if the intimacy was genuine, it should bring him closer in a way that is immediately visible. But the truth is often far more layered than that. Because real intimacy does not just bring comfort. It brings exposure. It does not just make him feel desired. It makes him feel vulnerable. It does not just open the heart. It also touches everything in him that has learned to fear an open heart. That is why true intimacy can become such a turning point. Not because it only says, here is love, but because it also says, here is everything in you that has not yet learned how to stay open to love without fear. And that changes everything. The divine masculine may think he is only reacting to the connection, when in reality he is reacting to the collision between the connection and his unresolved inner world. He is not just feeling closeness. He is feeling what closeness awakens in him. He is not just feeling love. He is feeling what love touches beneath the surface. This is why the experience can feel so intense, so contradictory, and so hard to explain. Because he may genuinely feel the beauty of the intimacy. And at the same time, he may feel the pressure of every wound it has activated. That pressure can be enormous. A man may long for deep love all his life and still feel destabilized the moment real love reaches him. Not because he is false, not because the connection is imaginary, not because intimacy itself is wrong, but because the human heart does not carry only longing. It also carries history. It carries memory. It carries fear. It carries pain that was never fully processed. It carries beliefs built in moments of loss, shame, rejection, emotional absence, or disappointment. So when true intimacy arrives, it does not enter an empty room. It enters a room filled with old survival patterns. And suddenly, what looked like a simple movement toward love becomes much more complicated. Because love is saying, come closer. And the wound is saying, be careful. Love is saying, this is what you have been hungry for. And the wound is saying, this is where people get hurt. Love is saying, you can rest here. And the wound is saying, do not relax too much. You may lose yourself. This is the internal tension that true intimacy awakens. And it is one of the main reasons the divine masculine changes afterward. He is no longer operating only from desire or attraction. He is now standing at the intersection of tenderness and fear. He is feeling not only how much he wants something, but how much it could undo the emotional control he once depended on. That is why his response can seem so paradoxical. He may feel more love and more fear at the same time, more longing and more resistance at the same time, more softness and more defensiveness at the same time, more clarity in his soul and more confusion in his behavior at the same time. Because intimacy is not only touching the man who wants to love, it is also touching the parts of him that learned why love might be dangerous. This is where we need to go deeper. What kinds of wounds are often activated? The first is the wound of not being enough. This is a very quiet wound in many men, but it can run extremely deep. The divine masculine may have spent years building a life that proves capability, strength, usefulness, reliability, competence, or value. But beneath all of that can live a hidden fear. What if who I am, underneath the performance, is not enough? True intimacy threatens this wound immediately. Because true intimacy is not impressed by performance alone. It asks for emotional presence, truth, tenderness, consistency, and the courage to be known. And if a man secretly fears that he cannot meet love at that level, then intimacy may awaken shame before it awakens confidence. He may begin thinking, even unconsciously, what if I cannot hold this depth? What if she sees who I really am and finds me lacking? What if I disappoint something sacred? What if I am strong in the world but weak in love? This wound can make him pull back not because he feels too little, but because he fears he may not be enough for what he feels. The second wound is the fear of losing control. Many divine masculine men have built identity around control, not always in a manipulative sense, but as a way of staying intact. Control may mean emotional regulation. It may mean staying composed. It may mean managing vulnerability. It may mean never letting feelings move too freely. It may mean always keeping part of the self protected. True intimacy threatens that entire structure. Because true intimacy is not fully controllable. It moves beneath logic. It reaches past roles. It creates feelings that do not always obey timing, planning, or structure. It makes the heart visible. And once the heart is visible, the old sense of mastery begins to crack. This can feel terrifying. Because for a man who has survived through control, the loss of control can feel like danger even when it is actually the beginning of truth. So after true intimacy, he may feel altered simply because he no longer feels fully in command of himself. He cannot easily predict his emotions. He cannot easily dismiss the connection. He cannot easily return to the same emotional distance. Something is moving in him outside the old system. That can feel like awakening and panic at the same time. The third wound is the fear of emotional dependence. This one is subtle but powerful. A man may unconsciously fear needing someone too much. He may fear what happens if another person becomes emotionally significant enough to affect his stability. He may have learned that relying on love is dangerous, that needing closeness creates vulnerability, that attachment can become pain. So when true intimacy begins to matter deeply, he may not only feel love. He may feel the terror of becoming emotionally dependent on something he cannot fully guarantee. This can create a powerful inner push-pull. Part of him wants to move closer because the intimacy feels real. Another part wants to reclaim distance because distance feels safer than needing. This is why some of the most affected men look the most conflicted. Not because the love is weak, but because the significance of the love awakens the fear of reliance. The fourth wound is the fear of abandonment after opening up. This wound often hides behind distance and composure. The man may tell himself he is independent, practical, self-contained, or careful. But underneath may live a painful belief. If I open too much, I could be left in that openness. And that is one of the most vulnerable places a human being can reach. To be abandoned while defended is painful. To be abandoned while open feels devastating. So true intimacy can activate a strange form of self-protection. The more he feels safe enough to open, the more another part of him begins preparing for loss. He may not do this consciously, but the nervous system may start bracing. What if this changes? What if I let this matter too much? What if I show too much and then it disappears? What if I cannot recover from being this open? These fears can create distance in advance, a kind of preemptive retreat. Not because he does not feel the sacredness, but because he does. And now he knows there is something to lose. This is what makes true intimacy so powerful. It raises the stakes. It takes love out of the realm of theory and makes it real enough to hurt. And once love becomes real enough to hurt, it becomes real enough to transform. The fifth wound is the fear of being seen too clearly. This may be one of the deepest of all, because many divine masculine men have learned how to survive by showing only what is manageable. They show strength, steadiness, humor, charm, control, competence, or silence. But true intimacy sees beyond that. It begins to notice the hidden tenderness, the unspoken grief, the emotional hunger, the contradictions, the fatigue beneath the composure. To be seen like that can feel holy and unbearable, because being seen means the private self is no longer fully private. It means someone has touched the place where he is most undefended. It means he cannot remain a role quite so easily anymore. And when that happens, shame can rise. Not because he is ashamed of being human, but because he may have spent years treating his deepest humanity as something to hide. This is why true intimacy can lead to sudden silence, retreat, confusion, or emotional distance. It is not always a rejection of the other person. Sometimes it is the nervous system struggling to process how exposed, alive, and emotionally visible he suddenly feels. This is also why people misread the divine masculine so often after real intimacy. They see the withdrawal and assume the intimacy was one-sided. They see the confusion and assume it was not meaningful. They see the inconsistency and assume it was superficial. But in many cases, the opposite is true. The intimacy was meaningful enough to activate everything. The love was real enough to touch the wound. The closeness was deep enough to shake old emotional structures. And the man changed because he is now living in the aftermath of that activation. He may not yet know how to hold it consciously. He may not yet know how to respond maturely. He may not yet know how to speak what is happening inside him. But something in him has undeniably been stirred. And this is where the inner battle becomes sacred. Because once true intimacy activates both love and wounds, the divine masculine can no longer pretend his journey is only about romance. It becomes a journey of healing, a journey of self-confrontation, a journey of deciding whether he will keep obeying the wound or begin listening to the deeper truth beneath it. That is not an easy choice, because wounds speak with urgency. Wounds say, protect yourself now. Wounds say, retreat before it gets worse. Wounds say, distance is safer than surrender. Wounds say, do not risk needing what you cannot control. But love speaks differently. Love says, stay long enough to see what this is really asking of you. Love says, there is more life on the other side of this fear. Love says, what feels dangerous may actually be what is trying to heal you. Love says, do not confuse vulnerability with weakness. This is why true intimacy changes him, because it puts these two voices in direct confrontation. And once that confrontation begins, the old life can no longer remain so simple. He may still choose the wound for a while. He may still retreat. He may still avoid. He may still move in circles of fear and longing. But he is no longer unconscious of the split. Now he feels it. Now he knows that something in him wants love and something in him fears it. Now he knows that what he called calm may have often been emotional suppression. Now he knows that what he called strength may have often been a refusal to need. Now he knows that real intimacy does not merely flatter the masculine ego. It exposes the masculine heart. And that exposure changes a man. Not because it ruins him, but because it reveals the exact places where he still needs to become more whole. That is the deeper truth of Chapter 4. The divine masculine changes after true intimacy, because true intimacy touches both his capacity to love and his fear of love at the same time. It awakens the highest part of him and the most wounded part of him in one single experience. It brings tenderness to the surface, and with it all the buried defenses built against tenderness. So yes, true intimacy can make him softer. But it can also make him more frightened. It can make him more open. But it can also make him more defensive. It can make him more aware of love. But it can also make him more aware of how unprepared his old identity is to live inside that love. That is why the aftermath can look messy. Not because the connection lacked truth, but because truth touched places that had never fully healed. And once those places are touched, change becomes inevitable. Because even if he runs, he now knows where the wound is. Even if he goes silent, he now knows what the silence is protecting. Even if he resists, he now knows that something deeper has already begun. The intimacy did not only awaken desire. It awakened the unfinished places in the soul. And sometimes that is exactly how real transformation starts. If you want, I'll continue with Chapter 5. Why he may become distant after feeling so much in the same tone and depth. Chapter 5. Why he may become distant after feeling so much. One of the most painful and confusing parts of the divine masculine journey is this. Sometimes the moment he feels the most is the moment he begins to pull away. And for the person on the other side of that distance, this can feel almost impossible to understand. How can someone feel something real, something deep, something undeniable, and then become quieter instead of clearer? How can a man experience true intimacy and then suddenly seem farther away? How can the same connection that opened him also become the reason he retreats? These are not small questions. They sit at the center of so much heartbreak, confusion, and misinterpretation. Because from the outside, distance often looks like disinterest. Silence looks like indifference. Withdrawal looks like rejection. A change in energy looks like loss of feeling. But in many cases, especially after true intimacy, distance does not mean he feels less. Sometimes distance means he feels more than he knows how to carry. That is the paradox. The divine masculine may become distant after feeling so much not because the connection failed to reach him, but because it reached him so deeply that his old emotional structure begins to overload. The nervous system, the ego, the protective self, and the wounded heart all begin reacting at once. And when too many inner forces awaken together, a man may instinctively create space not because he wants less love, but because he does not yet know how to remain steady inside so much inner activation. This is one of the hardest truths to understand if we only judge behavior at the surface. Because society often teaches us a very simplistic narrative. If someone cares, they come closer. If someone loves, they stay open. If something matters, it should create more visible expression, not less. And while there is truth in that at mature stages of love, the early phases of soul-level awakening are often far more complicated. Why? Because when true intimacy touches a man who is still learning how to hold emotional depth, the first response may not be expansion. It may be overwhelm. Not because love is wrong, not because the bond is false, but because intimacy has now activated layers of feeling that he can no longer easily organize. He may feel longing, fear, tenderness, shame, need, grief, hope, exposure, softness, panic, all at the same time. And when these feelings arrive together, distance can become his way of trying to recover some sense of inner order. This is why the divine masculine often looks most confusing right after something real has happened. He may have felt more seen than ever before, more emotionally touched than he expected, more internally exposed than he is used to, more stirred at the soul level than anything in his ordinary life has prepared him for. And instead of moving outward, he moves inward. Instead of becoming more expressive, he becomes harder to read. Instead of stepping forward immediately, he goes quiet. That quiet can feel cruel to the other person. But inwardly, it may not be cruelty at all. It may be internal flooding. There is a difference between not caring and not coping. And many people confuse the two. The divine masculine may not know how to explain what is happening, because men are often taught how to manage action more than emotion. They are often taught how to stay functional under pressure, but not necessarily how to process tenderness, vulnerability, attachment, or soul-level recognition in real time. So when true intimacy breaks open something deeper, he may not have language ready. He may not know how to say, "This moved me more than I expected." He may not know how to admit, "I feel deeply affected, and I do not know how to stay regulated inside it." He may not know how to confess, "Part of me wants to come closer, but another part of me is terrified of what this means." So instead, he withdraws. Not always forever. Not always consciously. Not always in a calculated way. Sometimes he withdraws simply because retreat is the only emotional skill his old identity trusts when feelings become too large. This is where the misunderstanding becomes painful. Because the person who shared intimacy with him may think, if it was real, why did he leave? If it mattered, why did he become distant? If he felt so much, why does he act like this? But the deeper question is different. Not, did he feel enough? But, what happened inside him when he felt that much? That is the real question. Because distance is often not the absence of impact. It is the consequence of impact. It can mean the connection got past his defenses. It can mean his heart is no longer untouched. It can mean he is now aware of deeper needs, deeper fears, deeper vulnerability than he was before. It can mean the old self is trying to regain control after intimacy disrupted its carefully managed structure. Think of it this way. Before true intimacy, he may have lived inside a familiar emotional architecture. He knows how to manage desire. He knows how to maintain control. He knows how to give enough to stay connected without losing too much of himself. He knows how to compartmentalize. He knows how to function while feeling only what he believes he can handle. Then true intimacy happens. Now the walls are thinner. Now the heart is more visible. Now the body remembers something. Now the soul has been touched. Now he cannot fully return to the same level of emotional detachment, but he also does not yet know how to live in this new openness. So what does he do? He creates distance. Distance becomes a temporary strategy for regulation. Not healthy in every case. Not always conscious. Not always fair. But often understandable at the level of inner mechanics. Distance gives him room to think. Room to numb. Room to reassemble. Room to regain the illusion of control. Room to avoid being constantly confronted by what the intimacy awakened. Because that confrontation can be relentless. When a man has been touched deeply, even ordinary moments may start feeling different. He may think of the connection when he does not want to. He may replay conversations. He may feel echoes of vulnerability in silence. He may notice how much the experience changed his inner state. He may feel the contrast between surface life and soul life more strongly than before. And that contrast can make him restless. A man who once felt comfortable in ordinary relational patterns may now feel empty inside them. A man who once relied on distraction may now find distraction less effective. A man who once equated emotional control with strength may now feel how fragile that control actually is when something real touches him. This is why he may become distant after feeling so much. Because now he is not only relating to the other person. He is relating to the collapse of his old emotional balance. And that collapse can feel frightening. Very often, distance is an attempt to reduce intensity. He may hope that if he steps back, the feelings will settle. If he goes quiet, the inner pressure will decrease. If he returns to routine, he can become normal again. If he avoids the mirror of intimacy, he will not have to face how deeply it changed him. But here is the deeper truth. Distance may reduce stimulation for a moment, but it rarely erases what true intimacy has awakened. Because real intimacy does not only live in contact. It lives in recognition. And once recognition happens, something in him knows. He knows he was seen differently. He knows he felt something unusual. He knows a deeper self was touched. He knows he cannot honestly say it was nothing. That is why distance often feels strange even to him. He may pull away and still think about it. He may go silent and still feel it. He may avoid the person and still not escape the truth the person awakened. He may try to regain emotional neutrality and realize that neutrality is no longer available in the same way. This is where the distance becomes especially painful, because it often fails to bring the peace he expects. Why? Because what he is trying to get away from is not just the connection. It is what the connection revealed inside him. And that revelation travels with him. This is also why distance after deep intimacy can look so contradictory. He may seem absent, yet deeply affected. He may seem detached, yet emotionally preoccupied. He may seem cold, yet inwardly softened in ways he cannot control. He may seem inconsistent, because one part of him wants to preserve safety, while another part wants to move toward what felt true. This inner split can create behaviors that feel confusing or even hurtful. He may reach out and then disappear. He may soften and then harden. He may open slightly and then shut down again. He may become more serious internally, but less expressive externally. And all of this often comes from one central tension. He has felt more than his old self knows how to integrate. That word matters. Integrate. Because feeling something is one thing. Integrating what you feel is another. The divine masculine may genuinely feel the sacredness of the connection. But if his inner world is still organized around protection, distance, and self-control, then the experience of intimacy may outrun his capacity to embody it. He may know something has changed without yet knowing how to become someone different in response to that change. That is why the distance is often transitional. Again, not always healthy. Not always justified. Not always a sign of maturity. but often a sign that something inside him is being reorganized. And reorganization rarely looks graceful in the beginning. It can look like confusion, like hesitation, like silence, like emotional contradiction, like someone standing between two versions of himself. One version says, move closer. This is real. The other says, back away. This is too much. One version says, you have wanted this depth. The other says, you are not safe inside this much openness. One version feels love. The other feels the cost of love. And until those two versions begin to reconcile, distance may feel easier than staying present, at least temporarily. This is why many people are shocked when the divine masculine becomes distant right after genuine intimacy. They expected the intimacy to solve the distance. But often, true intimacy first reveals the reasons distance existed in the first place. It exposes the fears, the wounds, the fragility beneath the appearance of masculine steadiness. It shows him how much he has relied on separation to remain emotionally organized. In that sense, distance is not always the opposite of intimacy. Sometimes it is intimacy's first disturbance. Sometimes it is what happens when love shakes loose everything that was previously hidden. And that does not mean the story ends there. Sometimes distance is only the first stage of confrontation. The divine masculine may need to sit with what was awakened. He may need to feel the insufficiency of old defenses. He may need to realize that running does not actually restore peace, only temporary numbness. He may need to discover that the pull he feels is not merely about another person, but about the more honest self that intimacy called forward. This realization can take time, because time is often required for the mind, the body, and the soul to catch up with what the heart already knows. And that is the hidden truth of Chapter 5. The divine masculine may become distant after feeling so much because he is trying to regulate a level of inner activation that his old identity was never built to hold. He is not always moving away from love. Sometimes he is moving away from the intensity of what love uncovered. He is not always rejecting the intimacy. Sometimes he is overwhelmed by the self it awakened. That does not make the distance painless. It does not make it fair. It does not mean it should be romanticized. But it does make it more understandable. Because not all distance means emptiness. Sometimes distance means the soul has been touched so deeply that the old self no longer knows how to remain present without first falling apart a little. And perhaps that is the tragedy and the beauty of this stage. The tragedy is that the person who feels the most may sometimes be the one who retreats. But the beauty is that retreat does not always mean the love was small. Sometimes it means the love was large enough to disrupt everything. And disruption, though painful, is often where real change begins. If you want, I'll continue with Chapter 6 in the same tone and depth. Chapter 6, the inner reorganization begins. After true intimacy, the divine masculine does not always change in obvious ways first. He may not immediately become expressive. He may not suddenly say all the right things. He may not arrive at instant clarity, instant devotion, or instant emotional maturity. In fact, some of the deepest changes begin in silence. They begin beneath the surface, in places no one else can fully see. And this is where so much confusion begins, because people often look for outer proof while the real transformation is still happening inside him. But true intimacy does not only create emotion. It creates reorganization. It starts rearranging the interior of the man. It changes what he can ignore. It changes what he can tolerate. It changes what feels empty, what feels alive, what feels false, and what feels real. And even if he does not yet know how to live differently, something inside him has already begun shifting. That is what this chapter is about. The inner reorganization. The invisible stage where the old identity is still standing, but no longer stands in the same way. before true intimacy, the divine masculine may have built an inner life around habits that once felt normal, even necessary. He may have relied on control, distance, logic, productivity, silence, compartmentalization, or emotional restraint. He may have moved through relationships in ways that kept him functional. He may have known how to stay involved without becoming fully vulnerable. He may have known how to protect himself while still appearing steady, calm, desirable, or capable. And for a long time, that may have worked, at least on the surface. But true intimacy changes the measurement, because once he has felt a deeper level of connection, once he has been truly seen, once something in his soul has been touched, the old structures begin to feel different. Not always wrong immediately, not always broken immediately, but thinner, less satisfying, less convincing. That is the beginning of inner reorganization. He starts noticing that the life he lived before this moment does not feel the same anymore. Things that once distracted him may not distract him as effectively. Things that once felt emotionally manageable may now feel strangely flat. Conversations that once seemed normal may now feel superficial. Connections that once satisfied him may now feel incomplete. The roles he used to inhabit with ease may suddenly feel too narrow for what he is now experiencing inside. And this shift can be subtle at first. It may not arrive with a dramatic realization. It may arrive as restlessness, a quiet discomfort, a sense that something is off, a growing inability to fully relax inside his old ways of being. He may not even understand why. But the reason is simple, even if the experience is not. True intimacy has shown him a deeper truth, and now the old self must reorganize around what it has seen. This is why the divine masculine can become more reflective after true intimacy. Not always because he wants to. Sometimes because he cannot help it. He begins replaying moments, conversations, silences, looks, feelings. He starts revisiting the connection inwardly, not only because he misses it, but because some part of him is trying to understand why it affected him so deeply. He may wonder why one person, one moment, one season of closeness feels more consequential than other relationships that seemed more straightforward. He may find himself comparing old patterns to what he now felt. He may begin seeing his own life differently through the contrast. And contrast is one of the great awakeners. Because once a man has felt the difference between surface-level connection and true intimacy, he can no longer experience surface in the same innocent way. He may still return to old environments, old behaviors, old ways of coping. But now he feels the difference. Now he knows what deeper contact feels like. Now he has touched something more alive. And because of that, the old ways begin losing their unquestioned authority. This is not always pleasant. Sometimes it feels like emptiness. A man who once felt fine in emotional distance may now feel lonely inside it. A man who once felt safe in silence may now feel how much his silence costs him. A man who once believed control was peace may now feel how tense that control really is. A man who once felt strong through detachment may now sense that detachment has become a barrier, not a strength. This is the pain of reorganization. Not because he is failing, but because his inner world is starting to tell the truth. And when the inner world starts telling the truth, old strategies begin to lose their emotional power. This is why true intimacy often makes the divine masculine feel different even when his outer life has not changed yet. Outwardly, he may still go to work, keep routines, maintain appearances, talk the same way, behave in familiar patterns. But inwardly, the meaning of those things may be changing. They may no longer feel sufficient. They may no longer provide the same sense of certainty. They may no longer protect him from his own heart the way they once did. That is the first sign of inner reorganization. What used to work no longer works in quite the same way. And this can create tremendous inner tension. because a man may not yet know what comes next. He only knows that the old self is becoming less comfortable. He may still try to return to habit, still try to regain control, still try to downplay what happened, still try to convince himself that nothing changed. But inwardly, he knows that something did. He may not say it aloud, but he knows. He knows because the old life feels different from the inside. This is where another important shift begins. He starts becoming more aware of his own patterns. Before true intimacy, many patterns can remain automatic. A man may withdraw without deeply questioning why. He may compartmentalize without noticing the cost. He may shut down, stay practical, change the subject, stay busy, remain emotionally elusive, and simply call that normal. But after true intimacy, he may begin to see these patterns more clearly. He may notice how quickly he distances when something feels too real. He may notice how often he defaults to control when he feels exposed. He may notice that his silence is not always peace. He may notice that his independence may have been partly fear. He may notice that his strength has sometimes been built around not being touched too deeply. These are difficult realizations, because awareness removes innocence. Once he sees the pattern, he cannot fully pretend it is just how he is. Now he begins sensing that some of what he called identity may actually be protection. And that insight is enormous. Because inner reorganization does not begin when a man changes behavior first. It begins when he changes interpretation. When he starts seeing himself differently. When he starts questioning the emotional structures he once trusted. When he starts realizing that some of his most familiar habits are not expressions of freedom, but strategies of survival. This can make him feel more serious internally, more thoughtful, more conflicted, more inward, not because he is becoming colder, but because his soul is becoming harder to silence. And when the soul becomes harder to silence, the man begins to hunger for something different. This hunger is another sign of reorganization. He may not know exactly what he wants yet, but he begins sensing what he no longer wants. He no longer wants only surface. He no longer wants only stimulation. He no longer wants only attraction without truth. He no longer wants only structures that make him look strong while keeping him emotionally divided. He may still participate in those things for a while, but they no longer satisfy him in the same way. This is one of the hidden reasons the divine masculine changes after true intimacy. Once he has touched something real, the false begins to taste flatter. Not always unbearable right away, but flatter, less alive, less nourishing, less able to quiet the deeper ache inside him. And this is where the inner life begins reorganizing around new values. Without even announcing it, he may begin respecting honesty more, depth more, presence more, emotional safety more, realness more. He may begin longing not just for affection, but for alignment, not just for desire, but for meaning, not just for connection, but for the kind of connection that does not require him to abandon the deeper truth now awakening inside him. This is an important threshold. Because once a man begins valuing depth over distraction, he is no longer the same man he was before. Even if outwardly he is still catching up. Even if behavior has not fully changed yet. Even if he is still inconsistent. Values are changing now. And changed values eventually demand changed living. This is also why inner reorganization can feel like grief. Because as a man awakens, he often begins losing parts of his old identity before he has fully built the new one. He may feel less comfortable in the old, but not yet stable in the new. He may feel emotionally in between, neither fully asleep nor fully integrated, neither fully hidden nor fully free. And that in-between space can be deeply uncomfortable. He may grieve the simplicity of who he was before. Not because that version was truer, but because it was easier. It was easier not to know. Easier not to feel so much. Easier not to notice the gap between appearance and truth. Easier not to question the patterns that once gave him stability. But awakening removes that ease. Now he must live with awareness. And awareness changes everything. This grief can be very quiet. It may not look like tears. It may look like fatigue, restlessness, withdrawal, a strange sadness, a sense of emotional heaviness, a need for solitude, a need to think, a need to pull back from noise. These are often signs that something is being metabolized internally. Not solved yet, but metabolized. And that matters. Because inner reorganization is not instant enlightenment. It is digestion. The soul is trying to absorb what happened. The heart is trying to make sense of what it felt. The nervous system is trying to adjust to a deeper level of truth. The identity is trying to survive the fact that its old operating system no longer fully fits. This is why real change takes time. Not because truth is weak, but because truth is powerful enough to require restructuring. And restructuring is not superficial. It reaches everything. How he sees love. How he sees himself. How he sees masculinity. How he sees control. How he sees vulnerability. How he sees the distance he once depended on. How he sees the possibility of being both strong and open. And perhaps this is the deepest layer of Chapter 6. The divine masculine changes after true intimacy, because the intimacy begins reorganizing his interior around a truth he can no longer dismiss. It disrupts old emotional systems. It weakens the authority of old defenses. It makes old ways of living feel less whole. It creates a hunger for something deeper, even before he knows how to live that depth consistently. So yes, he may look distant at times. He may look quiet, conflicted, slower, more withdrawn. But underneath that, something sacred may be happening. The structure is shifting. The inner world is rearranging. The man is being asked to become someone more honest than before. And that process rarely looks neat in the beginning. It often looks invisible. But invisibility does not mean absence. It means the roots are growing before the tree changes shape. That is what true intimacy often does. It plants a truth so deep inside the divine masculine that the whole interior must begin adjusting around it. He may fight that adjustment, delay it, misunderstand it, try to outrun it. But if the intimacy was real, the reorganization has already begun. Because once a man has touched something sacred, something in him starts moving toward greater alignment, whether slowly or suddenly, consciously or in silence. And that is why he can never remain entirely the same. The outside may take time, but the inside has already started turning. If you want, I'll continue with Chapter 7 in the same tone and length. Chapter 7. The divine feminine did not change him by force, she revealed him. One of the most misunderstood ideas in these kinds of soul-level connections is the belief that the divine feminine is the one who changes the divine masculine. People often speak as if her love transformed him, her patience healed him, her presence fixed him, or her devotion somehow created a new man. They describe it as though she entered his life and caused the awakening by force of feeling, by spiritual depth, by unconditional love, or by simply being the one. And while there is a reason people describe it this way, because her presence can be profoundly catalytic, the deeper truth is more subtle than that. She did not change him by force. She revealed him. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because the moment we believe the divine feminine changed him by force, we start moving into a dangerous misunderstanding. We start imagining that one person's love can override another person's readiness. We start romanticizing emotional labor. We start glorifying waiting, overgiving, self-abandonment, and suffering in the name of transformation. We start telling stories where the feminine becomes responsible for carrying the entire burden of the masculine's awakening. But awakening does not work that way. No one can force a soul to become ready. No one can love another person into permanent wholeness if that person is still refusing responsibility for what has been revealed. No one can create truth inside another human being by trying harder, sacrificing more, or staying longer than their own soul can bear. What the divine feminine often does is something both simpler and more powerful. She becomes the mirror. She becomes the field of truth in which the divine masculine can no longer avoid seeing himself as clearly as before. That is very different from changing him by force. A mirror does not invent what it reflects. It reveals what is already there. If there is beauty, the mirror shows beauty. If there is pain, the mirror shows pain. If there is fear, the mirror shows fear. If there is tenderness, the mirror shows tenderness. If there is contradiction, the mirror shows contradiction. The mirror is not the author of the inner reality. It is the revealer of it. And that is often what the divine feminine becomes in true intimacy. She reflects back to the divine masculine the parts of himself he has managed not to fully face. She reflects his depth. She reflects his wounds. She reflects his longing. She reflects his guardedness. She reflects the split between the man he presents and the man he actually is beneath the armor. She reflects not only his love, but also the places where he is still afraid of love. That reflection can feel life-changing. But it is not force. It is recognition. This is why he changes after being with her. Not because she installed something new into his soul, but because in her presence, what was already inside him became harder to deny. Think about how powerful that really is. A man may go through much of life being seen for what he does rather than who he is. He may be appreciated for competence, admired for strength, desired for presence, respected for reliability, or valued for what he can provide. But none of that necessarily means he has been deeply met. None of that necessarily means anyone has touched the inner terrain beneath the role. Then the divine feminine appears, not necessarily perfect, not necessarily mystical in some dramatic sense, but deeply present in a way that is difficult to hide from. She listens beneath the words. She feels beneath the surface. She notices the energy beneath the behavior. She senses what he avoids. She feels the tenderness beneath the control. She recognizes the sadness beneath the silence. She sees the heart beneath the masculine role. And suddenly, the man who has lived comfortably enough inside image, restraint, and emotional management finds himself standing before someone whose presence reflects the deeper truth back to him. That is unsettling. Not because she is controlling him, but because he can feel himself in her presence more clearly than he is used to. That clarity is what changes him. Because once a man starts feeling himself more clearly, the old identity becomes harder to maintain without discomfort. He starts realizing that some of what he called strength was actually protection. Some of what he called calm was actually emotional distance. Some of what he called independence was actually fear of needing. Some of what he called stability was actually numbness with good posture. And when these realizations start happening, of course he changes. How could he not? But again, the important truth is that she did not force that realization into him. She reflected the conditions in which realization became possible. That is the sacred role of the mirror. And this is where we need maturity. Because many people hear this and immediately slip into fantasy. They think, so if I just love deeply enough, mirror clearly enough, stay patient enough, he will awaken. But that is not the lesson. The lesson is not that the feminine should work harder. The lesson is that truth, when embodied, becomes revealing. The feminine's deepest power is not in fixing him. It is in being real enough that falsehood becomes harder to maintain nearby. That is a very different thing. When the divine feminine is embodied, she is not chasing his soul into consciousness. She is not managing his growth. She is not negotiating with his wounds to convince them to heal. She is not abandoning herself to prove love. She is not becoming smaller, softer, quieter, or more endlessly available in order to earn his readiness. She is standing in truth, in emotional truth, in energetic truth, in soul truth. And when a man encounters that kind of presence, he often feels exposed in a new way. Not shamed, exposed. He can feel the gap between his words and his energy. He can feel the gap between his desire and his capacity. He can feel the gap between the love inside him and the fear that still blocks its expression. He can feel the man he could become. He can feel the man he still is. And that gap is one of the most transformative experiences of all. Because many people can live with contradiction as long as no mirror makes the contradiction visible. But once it becomes visible, once the split is illuminated, it becomes harder to rest inside it. That is why the divine masculine often changes after true intimacy with the divine feminine. He is no longer fully hidden from himself. The mirror has done its work. Still, we must be careful here. A mirror can reveal. A mirror cannot choose for him. That is one of the hardest truths in this journey. The divine feminine may reflect his soul, and he may still resist it. She may feel his depth, and he may still choose fear. She may see the man beneath the armor, and he may still cling to the armor for a season. She may awaken recognition in him, and he may still move slowly, inconsistently, or defensively. This does not mean the mirror failed. It means revelation and embodiment are not the same thing. A man can see himself before he knows how to live as that self. A man can feel truth before he knows how to organize his life around it. A man can recognize love before he knows how to hold it responsibly. That gap between recognition and embodiment is where so much pain lives. Because from the feminine side, she may feel what is true in him long before he is capable of living from that truth consistently. She may sense his soul before his behavior catches up to it. She may know he is deeply affected while also experiencing his distance, confusion, or resistance. And if she is not careful, she can start confusing his potential with his present capacity. That is where suffering becomes distortion. Because to say, "I see who he really is," may be true. But to say, "Therefore I must stay through any amount of avoidance, confusion, or inconsistency until he becomes that person," is not truth. It is self-abandonment disguised as spiritual loyalty. This chapter matters because it restores proper responsibility. The feminine reflects. The masculine responds. Or does not. The feminine reveals. The masculine chooses what he will do with what has been revealed. The feminine embodies truth. The masculine decides whether he will keep living in conflict with that truth or begin aligning with it. That is why we must never turn mirroring into rescuing. Rescuing says, "I will carry your awakening for you." Mirroring says, "I will remain true enough that you may finally see yourself." Rescuing overfunctions. Mirroring illuminates. Rescuing collapses boundaries. Mirroring keeps integrity. Rescuing begs to be chosen. Mirroring remains what is real whether it is chosen or not. And that difference is sacred. Because the divine feminine is at her most powerful not when she loses herself in his process, but when she remains deeply rooted in her own soul while reflecting truth clearly. Her power is not in emotional overextension. It is in authenticity, in coherence, in a presence so real that the divine masculine can no longer confuse surface with substance quite so easily. This is why some men are so shaken by true feminine energy. Not because she is loud. Not because she is dramatic. Not because she is trying to control outcomes. But because her presence quietly dismantles illusion. Around her, he may realize he is not as emotionally free as he thought. Around her, he may realize he is more wounded than he admitted. Around her, he may realize he is more loving than he allowed himself to know. Around her, he may feel both his highest self and his unhealed self come into view at the same time. That is an enormous experience, because what she mirrors is not only his pain. She also mirrors his possibility. She mirrors the deeper man beneath the defenses. The more honest man. The more conscious man. The more integrated man. The man who could love without performing. The man who could stay without hiding. The man who could meet intimacy as devotion instead of fear. That possibility can feel beautiful and terrifying, because once he sees it, he must eventually face the question, will I become who I now know I could be? That question is not created by force. It is created by revelation. And revelation changes a person because it removes some of the comfort of ignorance. Before, he could tell himself certain stories and believe them more easily. He could say he was fine. He could say distance was enough. He could say control was strength. He could say surface-level living was satisfying. But after true intimacy with a feminine presence that reflected him deeply, those stories begin losing power. Now he knows too much. Now he has felt too much. Now he has seen too much of himself. And that is why he changes. He changes because she showed him something? Yes, but not in the shallow sense. She showed him himself. Not through lectures. Not through force. Not through pressure. But through presence. Through attunement. Through truth. Through being real enough that his own unreality became harder to bear. That is the deeper meaning of Chapter 7. The divine feminine did not change him by force. She revealed him. She became the mirror where the man beneath the armor could no longer stay fully hidden. She reflected his soul, his wounds, his longing, and his contradiction all at once. And once a man is revealed to himself like that, some kind of change becomes inevitable. Not always immediate. Not always graceful. Not always complete. But inevitable. Because no one stays exactly the same after meeting a mirror that reflects not just who they pretend to be, but who they actually are beneath the mask. And perhaps that is the most sacred truth of all. Real love does not manufacture the soul. It uncovers it. Real intimacy does not force transformation. It reveals the places where transformation is now being asked for. And the divine masculine changes not because someone controlled his becoming, but because truth finally reached him deeply enough that he could no longer remain untouched by himself. If you want, I'll continue with Chapter 8 in the same tone and length. Chapter 8. Why true intimacy makes performance collapse. Before true intimacy, many divine masculine men know how to survive through performance. Not always in a fake or manipulative way. Not always in a consciously calculated way. But in a very real psychological and emotional sense. Performance can become part of how he holds himself together. He performs strength. He performs control. He performs calmness. He performs certainty. He performs stability. He performs emotional restraint. Sometimes he even performs vulnerability in carefully measured doses, just enough to remain connected without becoming fully exposed. And for a long time, this can look like maturity. From the outside, he may seem grounded, reliable, composed, self-contained, even deeply masculine in the conventional sense. He may know how to carry responsibility. He may know how to stay useful in a crisis. He may know how to appear unshaken. He may know how to maintain his image, his role, his position, his structure. He may even believe that this is simply who he is. But true intimacy has a way of exposing something deeper. What if much of that stability was also a strategy? What if some of that strength was built on emotional distance? What if some of that composure depended on never being too deeply touched? What if the identity he trusted most begins to fail the moment love becomes real? This is why true intimacy changes the divine masculine so profoundly. Because intimacy does not feed performance. It destabilizes it. It does not reward the mask for being beautiful. It asks what is underneath the mask. It does not only notice how he appears. It begins to feel how he truly is. And that is where everything starts to shift. A man can perform very well in ordinary life. He can perform competence in work. He can perform confidence in relationships. He can perform detachment when he feels vulnerable. He can perform desire without surrender. He can perform steadiness while his inner world remains tightly managed. In many environments, that works. In many relationships, that is enough. He can be admired, desired, respected, needed, even loved in a certain way. But true intimacy is not satisfied with that level of contact. Because true intimacy is not looking for an impressive identity. It is looking for a living soul. That is why performance starts collapsing after true intimacy. Not because he suddenly becomes weak, but because the old form of strength is no longer enough. Once the divine masculine experiences real intimacy, the kind that reaches past roles, past attraction, past surface compatibility, past emotional choreography, he begins to feel the limitation of the self he has relied on. He begins to sense that image cannot hold what truth is asking from him. He begins to realize that emotional control alone cannot sustain sacred closeness. He begins to feel that charm, competence, and structure may help him function, but they cannot replace presence. And that realization can shake him deeply. Because performance is often not just behavior. It is identity. A man may not simply act strong. He may believe strength means never letting too much show. He may believe masculinity means staying composed no matter what. He may believe leadership means remaining emotionally unreachable. He may believe being desirable means staying slightly guarded. He may believe maturity means being affected as little as possible. These beliefs can become so internalized that they no longer feel like choices. They feel like truth. So when true intimacy enters and begins asking for something beyond performance, it is not just challenging his habits. It is challenging the structure of who he thinks he is. That is why the process can feel so disorienting. Because now he is standing between two different definitions of masculinity. One definition says, be in control. Do not need too much. Do not reveal too much. Do not let love rearrange you. Stay strong by staying contained. The other definition, the one intimacy is awakening, says something very different. Real strength is not numbness. Real presence is not performance. Real masculinity is not emotional absence. Real love will ask more of you than image can provide. And when those two definitions collide, performance begins to crack. This is why the divine masculine can become so inwardly shaken after true intimacy. He begins to notice the gap between what he presents and what he feels. He begins to notice how exhausting it is to keep appearing unaffected when inwardly he is anything but unaffected. He begins to feel how thin certain forms of self-control really are when the heart has been deeply touched. He begins to realize that some of the ways he has related to love were never designed for soul-level truth. That realization can feel like loss. Because whenever performance collapses, something familiar dies. Not the soul, not love, but the old reliance on image. And image can feel very safe. Image is manageable. Image can be polished. Image can be protected. Image can receive approval. Image can stay in control. But intimacy asks for the part of him that cannot be polished into safety. It asks for the real man, the tender man, the conflicted man, the afraid man, the longing man, the emotionally unfinished man. the honest man beneath the role. That is the man performance was designed to hide. And that is the man intimacy begins to reveal. This is why after true intimacy, old ways of living often stop working in the same way. He may try to return to the role, to the composure, to the emotional management, to the half-open way of relating. But now something feels off. Now the role feels smaller. Now the mask feels heavier. Now the performance feels more obvious to himself. This is one of the most sacred and painful stages of awakening, when what once protected him begins to feel like suffocation. He may not know what to replace it with yet. That is important. The collapse of performance does not automatically mean instant embodiment. A man may see the old way failing before he has fully grown into the new way of being. He may feel the falseness of performance long before he feels confident in truth. He may realize that image is no longer enough while still feeling terrified of what real emotional presence requires. That in-between space can be brutal, because now he cannot fully rest in the old, but he is not yet stable in the new. He may feel exposed without yet feeling free. He may feel stripped without yet feeling integrated. He may feel more real inwardly, but less certain outwardly. And this is where people often misunderstand him. They see the disorientation and think he is regressing. But sometimes he is not regressing. Sometimes the old self is simply collapsing faster than the new self is forming. That collapse is rarely graceful. It can look like silence, like confusion, like inconsistency, like emotional vulnerability followed by retreat, like moments where he suddenly realizes that the way he used to carry himself is no longer enough to meet the truth of what he feels. And the deeper the intimacy, the more undeniable this becomes. Because true intimacy does not allow performance to remain comfortably intact. It keeps exposing the limits of it. It keeps showing him that appearing strong is not the same as being whole. That appearing calm is not the same as being at peace. That appearing self-contained is not the same as being emotionally free. That appearing masculine is not the same as embodying a mature, conscious masculinity. This is why one real connection can change him more than years of surface relationships ever did. Surface relationships can coexist with performance. Sacred intimacy cannot. Surface relationships may never ask him to move beyond the role. True intimacy asks him to become someone the role can no longer contain. And that is when life starts changing from the inside out. He may begin questioning the way he shows up in love, questioning the kind of masculinity he inherited, questioning why he equated feeling less with being stronger, questioning why emotional distance felt safer than emotional truth, questioning whether the version of himself he protected most fiercely was ever actually his deepest self. These questions matter because they signal the beginning of a much deeper transformation. Not just emotional change, identity change. Because performance collapses when a man starts valuing truth more than image. At first, he may not know how to live that truth yet. But once he values it, the old self starts losing authority. This may show up in subtle ways. He becomes less satisfied by shallow admiration, less energized by empty attention, less interested in looking strong at the cost of feeling dead inside, less willing to pretend something does not matter when it clearly does, less able to enjoy relationships that require him to remain emotionally split. This is how performance begins dying. Not always in one dramatic moment, but through repeated inner realizations, repeated discomfort, repeated encounters with the insufficiency of image, repeated experiences of feeling the soul ask for more. And that more is not perfection. It is presence. Presence that does not hide behind charm. Presence that does not disappear behind silence. Presence that does not use ambiguity as a shield. Presence that can stay connected to truth even when truth feels vulnerable. That is what intimacy is calling out of him. Not a better performance of love, a truer embodiment of it. This is also why true intimacy can feel like a threat to the old masculine identity. Because if he becomes truly present, then control must soften. If he becomes truly honest, then image must crack. If he becomes truly available, then distance must lose its power. If he becomes truly conscious, then the old role can no longer remain his home. And for a man who has lived inside that role for years, maybe decades, this can feel like standing on the edge of ego death. Not dramatic destruction, but the painful loosening of a false structure. The realization that what once kept him safe is now keeping him disconnected. That is the deeper reason performance collapses after true intimacy. Because intimacy reveals that the role is no longer enough for the reality of what he feels. And once he knows that, he cannot unknow it. He may resist. He may delay. He may try to rebuild the image. He may return to old habits for a while. But something in him has already seen through the performance now. He has felt the difference between being impressive and being real. He has felt the difference between controlled connection and sacred closeness. He has felt the difference between a masculinity built on armor and a masculinity called into truth. And that difference changes everything. Because once a man truly feels how empty performance can become, he starts hungering for something more alive, more honest, more integrated, more whole. This is where the collapse becomes sacred. Not because it feels good, but because it clears space. Space for a different kind of man to emerge. A man who does not need to be untouched in order to feel strong. A man who does not need to be unreadable in order to feel masculine. A man who does not need to perform steadiness while internally falling apart. A man who can let love deepen him instead of only threaten him. A man who can carry truth, not just image. That is the man true intimacy is calling forward. And that is why the divine masculine changes after true intimacy. Because what he built to survive may no longer be enough to live from. Because the old role begins to crack under the weight of a deeper truth. Because the performance that once looked like strength starts feeling like separation. Because once the soul has been touched, the mask becomes harder to wear without pain. And in that pain, something sacred begins. The collapse of what is false. The exposure of what is real. The slow birth of a masculinity no longer built only on control, distance, and performance, but on presence, truth, and the courage to remain fully alive. If you want, I'll continue with Chapter 9 next in the same tone and depth. Chapter 9. Change can look messy before it looks sacred. One of the hardest truths to accept about the divine masculine journey is this. Real change does not always look beautiful in the beginning. In fact, some of the most sacred transformations first appear as confusion, as silence, as contradiction, as grief, as emotional instability, as resistance, as a man who no longer fits inside his old identity, but has not yet learned how to live inside the new one. And from the outside, this stage can be deeply unsettling, because people often expect awakening to look graceful. They imagine that if something is spiritual, soul level, or truly transformative, then it should immediately create peace, clarity, devotion, and visible maturity. They expect the process to look elevated, clean, enlightened, easy to admire. But real transformation is rarely like that at first. Because before something sacred can be embodied, something false usually has to begin falling apart. That is why change can look messy before it looks holy. The divine masculine may seem more confused after true intimacy, not less. More conflicted, not less. More inward, more quiet, more emotionally unpredictable. More visibly affected by things he once seemed able to handle. He may appear torn between who he has been and who something deeper is asking him to become. He may look less certain precisely because something real has interrupted the old certainty. And that interruption is not failure. It is often the beginning of reformation. This matters because many people misread the messy stage. They think if he were truly awakening, wouldn't he be clearer? Wouldn't he be more present? Wouldn't he be more emotionally available right away? But the deeper question is different. What has to break down in a man before he can actually become more true? That is the question Chapter 9 asks. Because awakening is not just the addition of light. It is also the disruption of old structures. It is not just discovering love. It is confronting everything in the self that cannot yet fully live from love. It is not just feeling truth. It is grieving the identity that was built to survive without truth. And grief is rarely tidy. When the divine masculine begins changing after true intimacy, he may enter a stage where the old self is unraveling, but the new self is not yet stable. That is a deeply vulnerable place to be. It is the space between identities, between patterns, between emotional realities, between one way of being and another. He may feel as though he is losing his footing. What once felt normal feels different. What once felt strong feels heavy. What once felt safe feels lifeless. But what comes next is not yet fully formed. So he stands in the threshold. And thresholds are messy. Because thresholds do not belong to the old world or the new one. They are the in-between. The sacred disorder between who he was and who he is becoming. This disorder can show up in many ways. It may show up as confusion. He knows something has changed, but he cannot fully explain what. He feels more affected than before, but not yet more articulate. He senses that the connection mattered, that the intimacy touched him deeply, that the old self is no longer fully intact. But instead of clean insight, he experiences emotional fog. Not because nothing is happening, but because too much is happening at once. It may show up as grief. Not always obvious grief. Not always tears. Sometimes grief appears as heaviness, fatigue, silence, a kind of unnameable sorrow. Why? Because part of him is beginning to mourn. He may be mourning the years he spent disconnected from himself. Mourning the simplicity of emotional numbness. Mourning the life he built around control. Mourning the version of masculinity that no longer feels whole. Mourning the relationships in which he was never fully present. Mourning the tenderness he once rejected in himself. It may show up as resistance. Because even when the soul wants truth, the ego often fears what truth will cost. He may resist change not because he wants to stay asleep, but because the familiar identity still feels safer than the unknown. He may return to old habits. He may try to reclaim control. He may become more practical, more distant, more avoidant, more guarded. Not because the awakening is fake, but because his protective self is trying to survive the loss of certainty. It may show up as contradiction. He may move closer one moment and retreat the next. He may feel deeply and then go silent. He may recognize the sacredness of the connection inwardly while outwardly acting inconsistent. He may want truth and fear it at the same time. This contradiction is painful, but it is often part of the reorganization. Two selves are active now. The self built from protection, and the self being called into deeper embodiment. This is why the messy stage must not be romanticized, but it also must not be misread too quickly. Messiness is not always immaturity alone. Sometimes it is disintegration. And disintegration can be holy when what is disintegrating is false. That word is important, false. Not false in the sense that the man was fake in every way, but false in the sense that parts of his identity were built from adaptation rather than essence. He may have learned to equate control with strength, detachment with wisdom, silence with peace, emotional self-sufficiency with maturity. These ideas may have helped him function. They may even have earned him respect. But once true intimacy reveals a deeper reality, Those old beliefs begin to collapse under the weight of what the soul now knows. And collapse rarely looks elegant. When an old inner structure starts breaking, a man may not look more spiritual right away. He may look destabilized. He may look unfinished. He may look less polished than before. That is because awakening is not cosmetic. It is structural. It changes the foundation. And when the foundation changes, the whole house trembles for a while. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of masculine transformation. People often celebrate the final result, but misunderstand the middle. They admire the integrated man, the conscious man, the emotionally honest man, the devoted man. But they do not always understand what he had to pass through to become that man. He may have had to lose his certainty, lose his old identity, lose his comfortable numbness, lose his polished image of control, lose the version of himself that knew how to survive, but not how to truly live. That loss can feel like a death. Not a literal death, but a death of self-concept, a death of illusion, a death of the old emotional system. And every death, even sacred ones, comes with disorientation. This is why change can look messy before it looks sacred. Because sacred change often begins as ego disruption. The man who once looked composed may suddenly feel internally fragmented. The man who once moved through relationships with relative confidence may now feel strangely unsure. The man who once relied on old strategies may find them failing him. The man who once thought he knew who he was may now realize he only knew who he had learned to be. That realization is not gentle. It can bring anger. Not always outward anger, but inner frustration. Frustration that he does not know how to handle himself the way he used to. Frustration that he cannot easily dismiss what he feels. Frustration that the connection touched him so deeply. Frustration that old distractions work less well now. Frustration that the journey is asking more of him than he wants to give. Frustration that he cannot go backward without feeling the deadness of it. It can bring loneliness. Because even if he is surrounded by people, this phase can feel isolating. Awakening often creates an interior experience that others cannot fully see. He may not know how to explain what is happening. He may feel separated not only from others, but from the old version of himself. He is no longer fully at home in who he was, but not yet at home in who he is becoming. That is a lonely threshold. It can bring silence. Not always because he is hiding everything, but because language often lags behind transformation. He may feel what he cannot yet say. He may know something is ending and something is beginning, but he may not have the words. So he grows quieter, more private, more reflective, more inward. Silence in this stage is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is gestation. And still, this stage can be painful for everyone involved. Because sacredness does not remove impact. If he is inconsistent, it still hurts. If he withdraws, it still hurts. If he becomes unclear, it still hurts. If his growth is slow, it still hurts. We do not need to romanticize the messy stage in order to understand it. We can hold both truths. The process may be spiritually significant, and the behavior may still be difficult. The transformation may be real, and the confusion may still create pain. Compassion and discernment must live together here. But if we are trying to understand why the divine masculine changes after true intimacy, we must leave room for the reality that sacred transformation often looks like disorder before it looks like wisdom. Because wisdom is not usually born fully formed. It is forged. And forging involves fire. Fire is not neat. It melts what cannot remain. It weakens old forms. It makes the material malleable. It creates a stage where what once seemed solid is no longer fixed. That is what true intimacy can do to the masculine soul. It can become the fire that softens what was rigid, the fire that exposes what was brittle. the fire that reveals which parts of the self were alive and which parts were only defended. And during that burning, of course he may not look serene. He may look undone. But being undone is not always destruction. Sometimes it is preparation. Sometimes the man must be undone in the places where he was over-identified with control, image, distance, or emotional restraint. Sometimes he must lose the certainty of the old self before he can grow into a masculinity that is more conscious, more truthful, more integrated. Sometimes the cracking is the beginning of the opening. This is why the sacred is often hidden inside the mess. Not because the mess itself is the goal, but because the mess reveals where the old structure can no longer hold. And once the old structure can no longer hold, real rebuilding can begin. A more conscious masculinity can begin. A masculinity not built only on stoicism, but on truth. Not built only on endurance, but on emotional responsibility. Not built only on control, but on presence. Not built only on role, but on soul. That version of him may not be visible yet in Chapter 9. But the conditions for his emergence are being created here. In the breakdown. In the contradictions. In the grief. In the resistance. In the painful awareness that what once felt like identity may actually have been armor. And armor always looks messy when it starts falling off. Because the skin underneath is tender, unpracticed, exposed to air again. That tenderness can make him seem slower, quieter, more fragile, more confused than before. But perhaps that is because for the first time, he is not only relating from armor. He is beginning, however imperfectly, to feel from the living self underneath it. And that self is still learning how to stand. That is the deeper truth of Chapter 9. Change can look messy before it looks sacred, because sacred change often begins with the dismantling of what was never fully true. The divine masculine may appear conflicted, silent, resistant, or emotionally disorganized not because nothing meaningful is happening, but because something meaningful is undoing the old foundations. He may look less certain before he becomes wiser, less stable before he becomes more whole, less impressive before he becomes more real. This stage is not the final form. It is the threshold, the rough, human, uncomfortable middle between awakening and embodiment. And if he keeps going, if he keeps listening, if he keeps allowing truth to do its work, then what looks messy now may later reveal itself as the holiest part of the process. Because sometimes the soul must first unravel what the ego built. Sometimes the false must fall before the true can stand. Sometimes a man must lose the shape of who he was in order to become the man intimacy was always trying to awaken. And that becoming, though painful, is sacred indeed. If you want, I'll write Chapter 10 next with the final integration, inspirational closing, and CTA. Chapter 10. The real reason he changes. In the end, the divine masculine does not change after true intimacy simply because he fell in love. He changes because true intimacy makes it impossible to remain the same man inside. That is the deepest truth beneath everything we have explored. Not every connection changes a man. Not every attraction transforms him. Not every relationship reaches deeply enough to interrupt the identity he has built. But true intimacy does something far more powerful than create emotion. It creates revelation. It reveals the man to himself. And once that revelation begins, change becomes inevitable. This is why the change can feel so confusing from the outside. People often look for one simple reason. They ask, did he change because he loved her? Did he change because he got scared? Did he change because he was wounded? Did he change because the connection was spiritual? But the answer is more layered than any single explanation. He changes because true intimacy touches every layer at once. It touches love. It touches fear. It touches longing. It touches grief. It touches the hidden need to be seen. It touches the wound of being seen too clearly. It touches the identity he built to survive. It touches the soul that was waiting underneath that survival. And when all of that is touched, a man cannot return to himself in the same way. That is the real reason he changes. He changes because something in him has now awakened enough to expose what no longer fits. The old ways of coping no longer feel as satisfying. The old forms of control no longer feel as strong. The old emotional distance no longer feels as peaceful. The old performance no longer feels as convincing. The old life, the old mask, the old identity may still exist for a while, but they no longer sit on him as naturally as they once did. True intimacy creates that shift. It does not only bring another person close. It brings the hidden self close. It brings buried truth close. It brings the gap between image and essence close. It brings the man face to face with the parts of himself he could once avoid. And that encounter changes him more than the relationship alone ever could. This is why the divine masculine may look different after true intimacy, even if he has not yet learned how to live differently. He may still be silent. He may still be confused. He may still hesitate. He may still pull away. He may still be standing in the middle of his own inner contradiction. But beneath all of that, the essential thing has already happened. He has been touched deeply enough to know that something real exists beyond the life he was living before. And once a man knows that, the soul begins asking more of him. It asks for more honesty, more congruence, more courage, more maturity, more emotional truth, more willingness to stop calling fear wisdom, more willingness to stop calling distance peace, more willingness to stop calling performance strength. That is why true intimacy changes him, because it asks him a question he can no longer avoid. Will you keep living as the man who learned to survive? Or will you begin becoming the man your soul has been trying to awaken? That is the real turning point. And it is sacred because the answer is not only about love. It is about identity. It is about whether he will remain loyal to his armor or become loyal to his truth. It is about whether he will keep protecting himself from life or finally let life transform him. It is about whether he will continue standing outside the doorway of his own heart or step through it, even trembling, even imperfectly, even slowly. This is why true intimacy is never a small event in the divine masculine journey. It may look like one relationship, one moment, one season, one bond, one person, one conversation, one experience of being seen. But inside him, it becomes something much larger. It becomes a mirror showing him his tenderness, a mirror showing him his wounds, a mirror showing him his longing, a mirror showing him his contradiction, a mirror showing him the deeper man beneath the role. And once he has seen that man, he can no longer fully pretend that the role is enough. That is why the aftermath of true intimacy is so powerful. It is not just about whether he misses the connection. It is about whether he can still live comfortably inside the version of himself that existed before the connection revealed more. Often the answer is no. Not comfortably. Not completely. Something begins to ache inside the old life. Something begins to feel the emptiness of the old patterns. Something begins to hunger for greater wholeness. That hunger is sacred, because it means the soul is no longer satisfied with survival alone. The soul wants embodiment now. It wants alignment. It wants a masculinity that is not only controlled, but conscious. Not only strong, but true. Not only admirable, but alive. Not only desired, but deeply present. And this is the final reason he changes after true intimacy. Because intimacy did not just give him feelings. It gave him self-recognition. It showed him that beneath the armor was a man who could feel more deeply, love more truly, grieve more honestly, and live more wholly than his old identity allowed. It showed him that what he thought was strength may have been separation. It showed him that what he thought was peace may have been numbness. It showed him that what he thought was enough may no longer be enough once the soul has awakened. This realization is painful, but it is also beautiful, because the divine masculine does not change after true intimacy because he is ruined. He changes because he is being called into a truer form of himself. He is being called out of emotional exile, out of the prison of performance, out of the illusion that control can replace closeness, out of the belief that he must remain hidden to remain safe, out of the old masculinity that taught him to endure without feeling, and into something deeper, into sacred masculinity, into emotional integrity, into grounded presence, into a life where strength and tenderness no longer have to be enemies. That is the hidden grace of true intimacy. It does not come to destroy the divine masculine. It comes to expose everything in him that is no longer meant to remain asleep. It comes to awaken the man beneath the strategy, the soul beneath the silence, the heart beneath the control, the truth beneath the role. And once that awakening begins, even if it is messy, slow, imperfect, and painful, change is no longer optional in the deepest sense. He may resist it. He may delay it. He may misunderstand it. He may move through seasons of confusion, avoidance, grief, distance, and inner conflict. But the deeper process has already started, because real intimacy does not disappear once the moment ends. It echoes. It lingers. It works beneath the surface. It keeps calling the soul toward honesty. It keeps showing him where he is divided. It keeps asking him to become more whole. And perhaps that is the final message of this journey. The divine masculine changes after true intimacy, because true intimacy is not just an experience of love. It is an encounter with truth. And truth, once felt deeply enough, does not leave a man unchanged. So if you are witnessing this journey, remember, what is truly awakened by love cannot remain asleep forever. The process may be slow. The process may be painful. The process may look messy before it looks meaningful. But anything real that touched the soul is still working, even in silence. True intimacy does not enter a man's life to shame him for his wounds. It enters to reveal the places where healing, truth, and wholeness are finally being asked for. And the divine masculine is not changing because he is broken beyond repair. He is changing because a deeper self has started calling him home. If this video spoke to you, share in the comments. What do you think true intimacy changes first in the divine masculine? The heart, the mind, or the soul? And if you want more deep videos on divine masculine awakening, sacred intimacy, emotional healing, and soul-level connection, subscribe and join this journey with us.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.